On the night I arrived, my son pointed to the backyard and said, "There's no room for you inside. The shed's unlocked." I stood there with my bag in hand, the same one he used to tug on as a little boy, asking if we could go fishing. Now he couldn't even look me in the eyes. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I hadn't seen him in 3 years, not since the funeral. I had driven 14 hours straight just to see my family again, to be part of their world, even if only for a few days. I had called ahead. I had even brought gifts. Nothing fancy, just things I knew they'd like. His favorite old maple syrup from back home, a hand-carved toy truck for my granddaughter, a photo album filled with pictures he hadn't seen since he moved out. And yet, he looked past me like I was a delivery man dropping off a forgotten package. "It's not personal," he muttered, adjusting his watch. "It's just hectic right now. The house is full, you know how it is." No, I didn't, because I had spent half my life making sure he never had to sleep outside. When money was tight, I gave up my own meals to keep his plate full. When the winters were harsh, I worked overtime laying concrete with frozen fingers just to keep the heater on in his room. But now I was being offered a wooden shed with a broken lock and no insulation. I didn't argue, not because I agreed, but because I had learned long ago. Pride doesn't shout. It waits. I walked toward the shed. Each step echoed like thunder in my chest. The door creaked open. Dust danced in the cold beam of my flashlight. There was an old rake in the corner, a rusted tricycle, and a rolled-up carpet that smelled of mildew. A pile of boxes leaned against the far wall, one of them labeled Dad's stuff. I didn't open it. There was a small bench. I sat down, placed my coat over my knees, and breathed slowly. The ache in my back pulsed in waves, but the ache in my chest, that one was deeper. Not because I was uncomfortable, but because I was unseen. I heard laughter from inside the house, the clinking of glasses, my daughter-in-law's voice talking loudly about a new investor and finally expanding the kitchen. I helped fund that house. He doesn't even remember. Back when he couldn't get a loan and came to me with his head down and hands shaking, I gave him everything I had. No contracts, no conditions, just faith. And now, I was a guest in the shadows of what I helped build. I didn't sleep that night. The wind whistled through the cracks in the wood, and the bench creaked every time I shifted. At one point, I leaned my head back and looked at the roof. A spider moved slowly across the beam above me. At least it had a home. As the hours crawled by, something inside me hardened, not with anger, but with clarity. People reveal themselves not when you give them the world, but when you show up with nothing but your name. And mine wasn't worth a warm bed anymore. But that was okay, because morning was coming, and with it, a truth they never saw coming. Friends, let me pause for a moment. Can I ask you something? Where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever experienced something like this? When someone you loved made you feel unwelcome? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Your stories mean a lot, not just to us, but to others who might be going through the same thing. If this story touched something in you, please consider liking this video, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. That's how you help us grow and keep telling these true-to-life stories that matter. All right, let's continue. The cold didn't bother me at first. At my age, you learn to live with discomfort. But it wasn't the chill in the air that made me pull my coat tighter around my chest. It was the sound of celebration on the other side of those thin shed walls. Joy I wasn't invited to. Laughter I didn't belong to anymore. They were toasting something. I could hear the clink of wine glasses, the rising hum of cheerful voices. My son's voice, deeper than I remembered, filled with pride as he spoke about finally landing the contract, and how this was just the beginning for them. Applause followed. Someone whistled. Another voice, likely his wife's, joked about buying a bigger house soon. And here I was, sitting on a wooden bench beside a rusted lawnmower, with spiderwebs in the corners and the floor so cold it seeped through the soles of my shoes. There was no pillow, no blanket, just dust, silence, and the sound of a man remembering what it felt like to matter. I had once printed his first resume on my office printer, stayed up all night helping him reword it so he'd stand a better chance at that internship, Drove across the city to buy him a tie he couldn't afford. I still remember how his hands shook the day he got the interview, how he hugged me without saying a word. Back then, I was the safety net beneath his dreams. Now, I was a burden with a key in the doorframe. There was a crack near the shed window. I looked through it. Inside, warm yellow light filled the kitchen. My granddaughter danced clumsily between the grown-ups, wearing a paper crown someone must have made for her. She looked happy, innocent, unaware, and it hit me she didn't even know I was out here. They hadn't told her I came. That stung. Not because I needed the attention, but because they had already begun the slow erasure, the kind that doesn't happen loudly but quietly, through omission, through silence, through a lack of chairs set at the table. You don't have to slam a door to lock someone out. You just have to pretend they were never supposed to walk in. I leaned back against the cold wall, closed my eyes, and listened. The laughter swelled again, plates clattered, music played. Soft jazz, the kind his mother used to love. That was the cruelest part. So much of that house had been built on memories we made together. Now it was filled with new ones I wasn't welcome to witness. I thought about the time I worked double shifts for weeks to pay off the down payment on that very house. My name was never on the deed. I didn't ask for it. I just wanted him to have a life I couldn't give myself. A home where he could raise his family safe, proud, and warm. And now I sat in a tool shed beside a pile of rotting newspapers, trying to remember if I had ever made a mistake so great that I deserved to be forgotten. But I couldn't think of one. What I could remember was every scraped knee I bandaged, every school project I stayed up helping him finish. Every night I came home with aching legs, but still smiled because he was waiting by the door. Fatherhood was never easy, but I did it, with every ounce of love I had, without asking for anything back. And still, here I was. Sometimes when people grow, they convince themselves they've outgrown the very hands that lifted them. It's easier to believe you built yourself when no one reminds you who carried the bricks before you. The shed groaned in the wind. I shifted my weight, and the bench creaked beneath me. And for a moment, I let the tears fall. Not from pain, not from weakness, but from something deeper. That ache you feel when the people you love most look at you and no longer see the man who raised them, but just someone in the way. I wiped my face with my sleeve and exhaled. They didn't know it yet, but this was the last time I'd ever knock on that door. The wind pushed against the thin walls of the shed like a memory trying to be heard. I pulled my coat tighter and leaned back, pressing my head against the cold wood, eyes fixed on nothing. The darkness outside matched the one inside, both silent, both familiar. And slowly, as my limbs stiffened from the cold, my mind began to drift, not to sleep, but to places I hadn't let myself go in years. I saw myself again, 30 years younger, sitting behind the wheel of my old pickup truck in the middle of a factory lot, midnight, winter, my hands trembling from exhaustion, a thermos beside me, long gone cold. I hadn't gone home because I couldn't waste the gas. I needed that money for his school shoes. I had fallen asleep there more times than I could count, the sound of forklifts starting in the morning my alarm clock. He never knew. He just woke up every day to warm oatmeal, clean socks, and a father who smiled like everything was fine. And when the bills piled up higher than the fridge, I sold my fishing gear. The one thing I bought for myself. Not because it was expensive, but because he needed a piano teacher. He had music in his fingers even as a child. I remember the way he'd tap on tables like keys, humming tunes no one taught him. That light was worth more than my comfort. I worked overtime to afford lessons. Drove across town after a 12-hour shift to pick him up from the music center. Listened to him complain about the dusty keys or how his fingers ached. He never asked how mine were. He thought comfort just existed. That heat came from walls, not men. That food showed up in cupboards, not from hands split open by steel and concrete. He believed in ease because I made the cost invisible. But comfort isn't free. It has a name, a heartbeat, a man who chooses to give even when nothing is left. That man was me. And as I lay there, staring at the cracked ceiling of the shed, I realized how deeply I had failed. Not in loving him, but in letting him believe that love didn't come with a price. I gave so much, he never learned what giving looked like. Maybe that's why he looked through me now. Maybe that's why a man could point to a shed and still sleep peacefully while his father shivered in the dark. He didn't remember what it cost me to give him peace. And maybe that was my fault. I should have told him about the nights I worked 2 jobs and still came home to help with homework. About the winter I walked to work because I sold the car battery to pay for his science camp. About the humiliation I swallowed at banks, at landlord offices, at pawn shops, all with his future burning like a torch in my hands. But I stayed silent, because dignity, I thought, was giving without expecting applause. Now I lay on a wooden bench, heart heavy, breath fogging the air. The man I had raised was warm inside a house I helped build, while I was out here, a ghost of sacrifices never spoken. Sometimes we think love speaks loud enough on its own, but maybe it needs to be written, named, taught, so that when the time comes, when roles reverse, it isn't forgotten. But it had been. I was forgotten, and as the wind howled again and the cold seeped deeper into my spine, I realized this wasn't just about a night in a shed. It was about years of being erased, not all at once, but slowly, in silence, in gratitude withheld, in warm homes that forget who lit the first fire. I closed my eyes, not to rest, but to remember who I used to be, and to prepare for who I'd need to become. Come morning, by the time the first light crept over the fence, I had already been awake for hours. My bones ached from the bench, my fingers stiff from the night air. I stood up slowly, quietly, the way old men do when they don't want to admit how much it hurts. Inside the shed, I had found an old tin kettle the night before, still usable, still mine. They must have thrown it out years ago when they cleared out my attic, the attic I paid for board by board. Funny how things that once meant warmth end up in places meant to forget. I boiled water using a small camping stove I brought in the trunk. I always carried it, out of habit more than anything. I poured the tea into 2 mugs, the second one cracked, but holding. The steam rose like something sacred in the cold air, and for a brief moment I felt hopeful. Hopeful that today might be different. That maybe my son had just been tired. That maybe his wife had simply been caught off guard. That maybe, once they smelled the tea and saw me standing there, not asking, not complaining, just offering, they'd remember. Not everything, just enough. I walked up to the back door. The curtains were still drawn. I didn't knock loud, just enough to be heard. A gentle tap. The kind that says, I'm here if you want me, but I'll understand if you don't. Moments passed. Then the door opened. She stood there in a robe, phone in hand, brows already furrowed from whatever meeting was ahead of her. Her eyes landed on the mugs. One breath, one glance. We're busy, she said. Maybe later. And she closed the door. No apology, no pause. Just the sound of a latch catching, as if to lock away the very idea of me. I stood there holding the tea, the steam still rising, slower now, softer, like a goodbye whispered from a distance. The sun was coming up, bathing the yard in gold. I looked down at the 2 mugs, one for me, one for a memory. I turned, walked back toward the shed, and sat just outside the door on the old wooden step. I took a sip. It had already gone lukewarm. The taste was bitter, but not from the tea. It was the kind of bitterness that doesn't show on your face, only behind your eyes. The kind that grows when kindness is returned with indifference, when your hands offer warmth and theirs return the cold. I remembered how every morning when he was a boy, I'd set out 2 cups of tea before work. Even when he didn't drink his, I made it. Not because he asked, but because I wanted him to feel thought of. Now I knew what that cup must have felt like, sitting alone on a table, untouched, cooling faster than it should have. Inside the house I heard movement, laughter, the sound of a blender. Someone was making breakfast. I wasn't asked to join, not even a glance through the window. I finished my tea in silence. The cup was empty, but my hand still held it, like some part of me believed it could be full again. And maybe that was the saddest part. Not the shed, not the cold, but the fact that I still hoped. even after everything, even after they had already decided I was no longer part of their mourning. It was just after sunset when I heard the faintest knock. Not like the sharp, dismissive taps I'd grown used to, but soft, hesitant, small, like someone wasn't sure if they were allowed to care. I turned toward the door of the shed. It creaked open slowly, and there she was, my granddaughter, barefoot, wearing pajamas with little stars on them, clutching a plush rabbit under one arm. Her hair was tousled, and her eyes held that curious innocence that hasn't yet learned what pride and convenience can do to a heart. "Hi, Grandpa," she whispered, almost like she was entering a secret place, and maybe she was. I smiled, the kind of smile you give when you're too full of ache to speak. She looked around the shed with a confused frown, her little eyes scanning the dusty corners, the cracked bench I'd made into a bed, the pile of old boxes with tools and forgotten memories. "Why are you in here?" she asked, voice tiny. I paused. How do you explain to a child that sometimes the people you love most forget where you belong? That sometimes being right doesn't matter as much as staying quiet? "Because sometimes," I said gently, "grown-ups forget things, even important things." She blinked. "Like what?" I looked at her, really looked, and saw in her everything I had once seen in her father. The same curious tilt of the head, the same way her lower lip tucked in when she thought too hard. She was a mirror I wasn't ready for. "Like who helped them build their world?" I said softly. She sat down next to me, pulling her legs up onto the bench without hesitation. No hesitation, no discomfort, just closeness. Her small body leaned against mine like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like warmth still had a place between generations. She handed me the plush rabbit. "You can hold him for a little." I did. His ear was torn, and he smelled faintly of strawberry jam. I held that rabbit like it was the last piece of softness left in my world. "I saw you through the window," she said. "You were just sitting, alone." There was no blame in her tone, just observation. A child noticing something the adults had chosen not to. "I wanted to bring you something," she continued, reaching into her pocket and pulling out a half-melted chocolate. "It's a little squishy, but it still tastes okay." I took it. Not because I was hungry, but because in that moment I had never been offered something so pure. She looked up at me again. "I won't forget you, Grandpa." Those words. They didn't come with any ceremony. No music, no lighting, no applause. Just truth. And somehow they shattered something inside me, because I realized she saw me. In a house full of adults, too busy, too proud, too distracted to remember who I was. She remembered. She saw past the shed, past the silence, past the aging hands and tired eyes. She saw me, and it hurt. Not because it was untrue, but because she shouldn't have had to be the one to see me, not at that age. She stood up after a while, brushed off her pajama pants, and looked back toward the house. "I have to go before Mommy sees." I nodded. She paused in the doorway. "You're coming inside tomorrow, right?" I didn't answer, just gave her a kiss on the forehead. Sometimes it's better to let a child believe in things that adults have already broken. She disappeared into the night like a flicker of grace, and I sat there, holding a chocolate, a rabbit, and the weight of a sentence I hadn't heard in years. "I won't forget you." And somehow that hurt more than all the cold in the world ever could. They never noticed the map of my life etched into my skin. My hands, thick and rough from decades of lifting, hammering, pouring cement, were hidden beneath the sleeves of my coat. No one asked how I came to own this land, this family home, or why I carried a leather folder everywhere I went. They saw an old man carrying luggage. I was invisible. That morning I stood behind their living room window, peering in as they bustled about. My daughter-in-law arranged flowers in a vase he had never told me needed watering. My son thumbed through his phone, scrolling through emails like they were more important than the father who'd once taught him to read. They spoke of deadlines, budgets, and next quarter's projections, as if nothing else mattered. Meanwhile, my bag lay in the shed. Inside it was a folder stamped with my name, the deed I had signed years ago, the document that made me the rightful owner of every brick and beam in that house. I waited, heart pounding like a drum, to see if they cared enough to ask. They didn't. Their hearts were closed, shuttered like windows in a storm, because to ask would mean admitting their debt. To open the folder would expose their ingratitude, would force them to face the man who'd built everything beneath their feet, and they were not ready for that kind of truth. I remembered how hard I had fought to keep that title clear. The nights I sat at lawyers' offices after a 12-hour shift. The phone calls made from payphones when I didn't have minutes on my own cell. The sacrifices so they could dream bigger than I ever dared. All those things I'd never mentioned, because a father's love is supposed to be without reward. But this wasn't about reward anymore. It was about justice. I walked to the shed, retrieved the folder, and held it loosely by my side. With each step, I felt the weight of their indifference pressing down on me, as if I carried a boulder instead of paper. The hammering of those past years, building walls, raising children, echoed in my bones. I paused at the door, the same door I'd knocked on with tea, with hope, with the memory of shared laughter, the same door that had always swung wide open for me until now. I lifted the folder to my chest, breathed in the cool air, and let the silence speak the words they refused to say. They didn't see me then. They never looked for me. But they would see me soon. And in that moment, standing in the morning light outside the home that was mine, I understood. This wasn't their house anymore. It hadn't been theirs the day they slapped a lock on my dignity. It was mine. Every nail driven, every joist raised, every brick laid by these hands. They could celebrate their promotions, their new deals, their perfect lives inside. They could pretend I was just a visitor they could send to a shed. But soon the reality would break through their facade. The reality that the foundation beneath their feet, and the ownership of the life they boasted about on social media, had always belonged to me. And after all those years of giving everything, I was finally taking something back. That night, the house was quiet before midnight. Too quiet. I drifted off in the shed, lulled by the distant murmur of their celebration inside, trusting that at least in sleep they'd remember I was there. But just after the moon passed its peak, I awoke to a soft thud against the shed wall. I opened my eyes and saw a pillow lying in the dirt outside the small window. Its white fabric was grimy at one corner, and the stuffing peeked out like a wounded bird. My son had thrown it, as if I were some stray they'd fed scraps, and now were casting back onto the street. I sat up slowly, lifting the pillow gently as though it might break beneath my fingers. There was no note, no whisper through the window, no soft voice to tell me sorry or that he hoped it would keep me warm. Just the cold night air and the hollow echo of a gift discarded. I held it against my chest and remembered the nights I patched his torn jacket sleeves, sewing thread through frayed cloth until the tears were gone. I recalled how I had once placed a pillow like this under his head on the hospital bed the night his fever broke, how I'd stayed awake, pressing it against his cheek, willing the world to ease his pain. Now I was the one left holding memories they no longer cared about. A gust of wind rattled the shed door, and I tucked the pillow under my arm, moving it beneath a burlap tarp in the corner. I didn't want it to get wet with dew. Even broken, it deserved more respect than I'd been given. I leaned back against the window frame, tracing the cracks in the dusty glass with my fingertip. Outside, the stars looked down like indifferent witnesses, tiny pinpricks of light in an uncaring sky. In that moment, I felt smaller than I ever had, a man who built walls and roads, now reduced to gathering cast-off comforts. But beneath the ache of humiliation was something else, a simmering resolve. They could toss me a pillow like yesterday's trash, but they couldn't toss away the years it took to make that house stand. They couldn't erase every night I lay awake worrying about their health, every sunrise I greeted with aching hands and a full heart. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The pillow at my side became more than a ragged piece of fabric. It was a testament, A reminder that even when you are treated like a delivery man, you retain the dignity you never asked to lose. I settled back onto the bench, positioning the pillow behind me as a makeshift backrest. My bones protested, but I refused to let the cold conquer me. Tomorrow, I thought, tomorrow they will learn that the man who empties the foundation keeps the key to every door. Until then, I would sit here, forgotten to them, but not to myself. They sat at the polished oak table, plates piled high with Sunday brunch, as if nothing had changed. I watched from the cold brick path leading to the shed, where dew lay like diamonds on the lawn. Inside, the golden light poured through lace curtains, illuminating faces full of gratitude, except mine. Moments later, my phone buzzed. A notification, their post. A smiling selfie of my son, his arm around his wife. My granddaughter grinning between them in a tutu too bright for dawn. The caption glowed with warmth and sanctimony. Family is everything. Blessed weekend with my loved ones. Beneath it, hearts and praises streamed in. Family first. Bas blessed. Bas grateful. They would see the likes, the comments telling them how inspiring it was to cherish those who matter. They would read the messages praising their happy home, their unity, their devotion, and they would feel the surge of pride, knowing they had penned that perfect truth. But truth, I remembered, isn't written with filtered smiles. It's tested in quiet moments, in the spaces between words. And right now, the smallest test was staring at me from the window, the father who built this life, forced to sleep in a wooden shed. I closed my eyes, tasting the bitter irony. I had spent a lifetime preaching through action, showing up at every recital, coaching every little league game, driving miles to comfort them when storms passed through their lives. My sermon was in sweat-drenched shirts and calloused hands, gripping nails in hope. Yet here they were, posting Sunday blessings, ignoring the man who had made every blessing possible. A bird landed on the fence, chirping as if telling me to speak up, but I stayed silent. I learned long ago that shouting truth often drowns in noise. Instead, I let the wind carry my testimony through the cracked window. Silent, undeniable. Inside, a pastor's voice could be heard from the television, speaking of love, of forgiveness, of honoring one's parents. My son paused for a moment, perhaps sensing the words weren't merely background noise. He glanced at the screen, then at the garden where I stood. His smile faltered, but he turned away quickly, eyes back on his phone to craft the next caption. That was their choice. To preach on Sunday and practice somewhere else on Monday. To wield hashtags like virtues while hiding their lapses behind filters. Their blessings were loud, their deeds silent. I inhaled deeply, the chill of morning filling my lungs. I felt more alive than I had in days, awake to the reality of who they were beyond the image they presented. I carried my own sermon, every nail I'd hammered into those walls, every dollar I'd sacrificed, every mile I'd driven alone. And though they could post prayers for family, they could not erase the legacy I had laid in concrete and timber. It would stand, unfiltered, unedited. The walls remembered, the floors remembered, even the shed remembered. I turned away from the window and walked back toward the detached shelter. My steps were steady now, each one carrying a quiet defiance. I wouldn't be unseen any longer. They may preach faith and family, righteousness and grace, but the smallest test, welcoming the one who gave you everything, was the one they failed. And their words, like filtered light, would fade. But the truth I bore in my bones would remain. I needed air, clarity, so I stepped out onto the quiet street before dawn, each footfall echoing in the empty neighborhood like a heartbeat in the night. My legs carried me away from the shed, away from the laughter behind closed doors, until I found myself standing before steel girders and stacks of brick, the very bones of the house I once owned. These beams were familiar friends, the ones I had laid out in blueprints on my kitchen table, the ones I had paced around as a younger man dreaming of giving my son a better life. My coat, worn and frayed, brushed against a chain-link fence, And on the other side, a young worker was locking up for the night. He recognized me immediately, eyes widening, shoulders straightening. He crossed over, boots crunching on gravel, and placed a hand on my arm. "Sir," he said, voice thick with gratitude and surprise, "you changed my life. You gave me my first job." I felt warmth bloom in my chest, a bittersweet flame that lit up memories of sweat-soaked days and the pride I once carried. Strange how a stranger could see the worth in these hands, in this man, even when my own blood could not. I remembered hiring that young kid straight out of high school, promising him steadiness and a place to belong. Watching him grow into confidence was a reward I never spoke of, because praise was never why I did it. He spoke of how that opportunity led him to support his family, how he told his children about the old contractor who believed in him. Tears pricked at my eyes as I realized the legacy I had built was not just wood and mortar, but lives lifted by unwavering faith in another person's potential. Here was a man shaped by the same compassion I once poured into my son's future, the same compassion that was now met with silence at home. The irony cut deep, a complete stranger honoring my past, while my son lived in the present without even remembering the foundation beneath his feet. I looked at the young man's earnest face under the street lamp's glow and felt both sorrow and pride. Sorrow for the family that had turned me away, pride for the countless lives I had touched without seeking anything in return. I nodded and whispered a quiet blessing before turning back toward the shed. The sky was lightening in soft pinks and golds, a new day breaking over steel and concrete. In that moment, I knew this walk wasn't just for clarity. It was a testament to who I had always been, and to the truth that sometimes a father's greatest gift isn't to those he loves most, but to the strangers who remember him when his own flesh has forgotten. That night, the shed felt smaller than ever. The faint glow of my phone screen was the only light, casting long shadows on the cracked ceiling above me. Every echo in that little space felt magnified, each drip of condensation, each creak of old wood. My heart pounded like a drum in my ears, steady and unrelenting. I fumbled through my coat pocket for the leather folder. The papers inside were crisp, final milestones of a life spent building, sacrificing, and hoping. I thought of every sunrise I greeted before the world woke up, every nail I drove into a joist, every handshake I offered to strangers who became friends. All of it led to this single moment, when a father no longer had to beg for dignity. I dialed the lawyer's number with deliberate care. The call rang through as my breath fogged the tiny screen. When he answered, his voice was calm, professional, nothing like the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. I listened to the faint click of his headset, the rustle of papers on his desk. Then I spoke. "Activate the clause," I said. Time froze. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. On the other end, the lawyer paused, the weight of my words hanging between us. He asked if I was sure, an echo of doubt I once carried when I worried about every penny, every brick. But I was past doubt. I had carried that for decades. I looked up at the rough-hewn planks above me, at the single bulb dangling uselessly outside the door. In that moment, I saw every late night I spent drafting contracts, every risk I took to secure our future, every sleepless hour I endured to keep the family safe. All of it bore down on me now with crystalline clarity. "I've never been more sure," I whispered, though the lawyer heard it too. The folder in my hand felt heavier and lighter at once, heavier with the consequences of a decision, lighter with the burden I was ready to shed. The lawyer confirmed the activation. The clause, a small paragraph tucked into the back of the deed, would transfer full ownership back to me with immediate effect. Conditions met, a father dismissed, a home reclaimed. It was poetic justice after years of unspoken prayers and unseen tears. I ended the call and slipped the phone away. Silence enveloped me once more, but it was no longer oppressive. It was charged with possibility. For the first time since I arrived, I felt something like peace settle around my shoulders. I stepped outside into the night air. The stars were bright, cold witnesses above the yard. The house loomed beyond the fence, its windows glowing softly. Inside, they were asleep, safe in the walls I'd built. They didn't know that by sunrise their world would shift beneath their feet. I closed my eyes, the wind brushing against my face, and allowed myself a single moment of closure. No anger, no malice, just the quiet satisfaction of a life's work acknowledged. Tomorrow the truth would emerge from these papers. Tomorrow the walls they took for granted would speak my name. And tomorrow I would leave with my head held high, free at last from the shed's shadows. Because sometimes justice doesn't roar in courtrooms. Sometimes it whispers through a phone call in the dark, and sometimes it arrives gently, like dawn breaking over a man who refused to be forgotten. I heard the lawyer's car crunch across the gravel at first light, a harsh sound slicing through the quiet of dawn. He stepped out in a crisp suit, briefcase in hand, and walked up the path toward the front porch where my family would never have expected him. Through the thin curtains, I saw my daughter-in-law place a fresh vase of flowers on the table. My son, dressed for work, paused mid-button as the front door swung open. He stepped aside, curiosity etched on his face. The lawyer entered, eyes steady, and produced the folder I had entrusted to him the night before. He laid it gently on the polished wood, its presence as heavy as the years of sacrifice it represented. No booming gavel, no angry confrontation, just the soft tap of paper against grain. My son's face shifted from polite greeting to confusion, then to disbelief. He pulled the top sheet free and began to read. The room fell silent except for the creak of floorboards as his wife drifted closer, eyebrows knitting. The letter spelled out inheritance conditions I had set decades earlier, conditions they had unwittingly trampled when they banished me to the shed. It declared that ownership of the house, all its rooms and memories, transferred irrevocably back to me, effective immediately. Their smiles faltered. The morning light that once felt safe turned cold through the windows. My granddaughter, still in pajamas, peeked around the corner, clutching her rabbit. She sensed the shift, the way adults freeze when the ground moves beneath their feet. No one spoke. I stood just out of view, leaning against the shed door frame, watching. The lawyer nodded once, finished his business, and left as quietly as he had come, leaving them to the weight of that document. I stayed where I was, heart pounding, breath steady, waiting for the next chapter of our story to begin. Inside, a chair scraped the floor. My son sank into it, eyes still glued to the paper. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "This can't be. You can't do this." But the words were empty, an echo of desperation. He turned and looked out the window, meeting my eyes for the first time since I arrived. There was fear there, loss, and a dawning realization that the foundation beneath his life was not his to claim. His wife stood, hands trembling over her heart, trying to gather words that matched the moment, but nothing came. The walls, once symbols of his success, had become the proof of his own blindness. I stepped forward then, each footfall measured, reclaiming the path I'd walked 1,000 times in sweat and hope. The moment I crossed the threshold, the world shifted. He rose, uncertain, as if greeting a stranger. I held out the folder, the papers rustling softly, and he took them, fingers shaking. No anger, no threats, just the weight of truth handed back to its rightful owner. I walked past them, the door closing behind me with a soft click, leaving their questions to echo against empty rooms. Outside, the morning sun warmed my face for the first time in days. I turned to watch them through the shed window, a family confronted by their own choices, the echo of my footsteps still ringing in their ears. And as I stepped away, I felt something I thought I'd lost, freedom, because at last the walls I built had spoken my name, and no one could ever silence that again. My son's face drained of color, the papers trembling in his hand like they were too hot to hold. He looked at me as though I were a stranger wearing his father's face. You own this house?" His voice cracked, disbelief and hurt tangled together. I met his gaze without flinching, the years of silent disappointment and unspoken dreams weighing between us like stones. He swallowed hard, glancing down at the shed in the yard where I had slept, where I had waited for even a crumb of kindness. You were living in your own shed? His question hung in the air, raw and jagged. I remembered every creak of that shed, every wind-whipped night, every moment I'd wondered if my own son could remember the man who built the walls around him. I stepped closer, the late morning sun warming my back, but not softening the truth I held. No, I said quietly, each syllable deliberate, like placing a final nail in a long-forgotten board. I was watching how you treat those you think can't help you anymore. His eyes flicked away, pain and shame crossing his features. He saw the calluses on my hands, the faded lines of a life spent giving, and at last he understood that gratitude isn't measured in posts or hashtags, but in the warmth of a welcome, the grace of a simple good morning. The room was silent except for the thud of his heart beating in his chest, a sound I had known before it belonged to him. His mother's china teacup trembled on the table, unused. My granddaughter peeked from behind her shoulder, confusion writ small on her face. In that moment, everything shifted. The walls I had built became more than wood and plaster. They were a testament to both love and loss. And as he stood there, shoulders slumped, he finally saw me, not as an inconvenience, but as the man who had given him everything he had. I turned away then, letting the truth settle in the rooms I once called home. No words of apology followed me. No tears begged for forgiveness. Only the echo of my steps on the hardwood floor, a reminder that sometimes the hardest thing a child must learn is to see the parent who never stopped seeing them. He crumpled where he stood, the folder slipping from his fingers as if it burned him. His knees hit the floor with a hollow echo that seemed to shake the walls I'd built with my own hands. He stayed there, head bowed, shoulders heaving in ragged sobs, tears carving silent rivers down the face of the man who once thought sorrow was something only strangers felt. I watched him break, that proud facade melting away to reveal the hurt he'd carried without knowing it. In that moment, I saw every time he had pushed me aside, the Christmas mornings when I stood at the doorway, later relegated to the corner, the graduations I attended but whose caps I never received in photographs, the dinners I cooked that sat cold in the kitchen while they murmured about new recipes and renovations, all the small betrayals that whispered, "You don't matter," until they became undeniable. He leaned into his grief, clutching empty air, and whispered, I thought you were just visiting. I didn't think it mattered." His voice cracked with the weight of regret, as if those words carried 60 years of lessons he had never learned. I could see the realization in his eyes, the jolt of seeing love not as a given, but as something earned and easily forgotten when convenience takes precedence. "That's the problem," I said softly, though my voice carried farther than any shout could. I stepped closer, the distance between us measured in years of silence. "You stopped thinking love matters without power behind it." I laid a hand on his shoulder, not to comfort him, but to anchor him to a truth he had long ignored. That love, like water, can sustain life even when no one notices, but dries up the moment you forget it flows both ways. He curled into himself, tears continuing to fall, and I saw him naked before me, stripped of ego, stripped of pride, finally facing the man he had taken for granted. I felt my own tears sting, not from anger, but from the sorrow of a father watching his child learn the hardest lesson too late. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, falling on the scattered papers and the lone chair I once called home. In that light, we were two souls laid bare, one seeking forgiveness he may never deserve, the other understanding that mercy sometimes means letting the heart break so it can heal. And as he knelt there, tears flowing freely, I realized that this moment, painful, raw, irrevocable, was the final act in a long story of devotion and neglect, because sometimes a man must lose everything he thought he had before he can truly understand what he ever had. In the hush that followed, I offered no solace. Not yet. I simply waited, letting the silence do its work, as two generations found a reckoning in the same tears. I stood in the foyer, the weight of their stunned faces heavy behind me. In my hand rested a simple ring of keys, old brass dulled by time, each one a silent witness to every nail driven, every beam lifted that had shaped this home. I felt their eyes on me, confusion, guilt, hope flickering in the corner of my son's gaze. My granddaughter peered around my legs, clutching her rabbit, sensing the gravity of what was about to happen. Without a tremor, I extended my hand. The keys glinted dully in the morning light, and I heard my own heart pulse, slow and steady, beneath the creak of the floorboards. I did not speak with triumph. I did not unleash the torrents of bitterness that had built up like storm clouds in my chest. Instead, I felt a profound, quiet sadness settle in my bones, a sorrow born of years spent giving everything and still being made to feel invisible. "This house is still yours," I said, voice soft enough that they had to lean in to hear, as if my words were fragile things that could shatter if spoken too loudly. They swallowed, their faces a canvas of conflicting emotions. "But remember, it was once mine. Every corner, every brick, every whisper of laughter and tears in these walls, it was born from my hands, my late nights, my sacrifices." The keys hovered between us, metal cool against my palm. They reached out together, my son's hand shaking as he took them, his wife's fingers brushing his in a tentative gesture of solidarity. I watched the weight of that small brass ring settle into his palm, as if fate itself rested there. My vision blurred for an instant, not from anger, but from the ache of letting go of something I had poured my life into. "And the only reason you're still in it," I continued, "is because forgiveness still lives where memory hurts." I saw his shoulders slump, the walls of defensiveness cracking at the seams. My granddaughter looked up, her eyes bright with understanding beyond her years. In that moment, I realized that this gift, this final offering of grace, was as much for me as it was for them. It was a release from the bitterness that could have consumed me, and a chance for them to rebuild on a foundation of truth rather than convenience. I turned then, each step toward the door, measured, deliberate, as if I were retracing the path of every long day spent building their world. I did not look back when I passed the kitchen where silent crumbs lay untouched, nor when I crossed the threshold into the yard where the shed still stood like a monument to neglect. I carried with me a strange lightness, an unexpected liberation found not in reclaiming ownership, but in offering mercy. Behind me, the door closed softly. I felt the cool breeze on my face and inhaled deeply, tasting freedom for the first time in years. I walked away without a backward glance, knowing that I had given them more than keys. I had given the gift of remembering, and it was a gift born not of pride or anger, but of a heart that still believed in the power of grace. I drove away that afternoon without a backward glance, the engine's rumble carrying me toward a horizon I'd almost forgotten existed. The city's edge gave way to winding country roads, and before long I found a modest cottage perched on a cliff overlooking the sea, salt-scented air, weathered shingles, a single oak tree standing guard. It wasn't grand, it didn't shout success, but its windows caught the sunset just right, and the wind whispered comfort against its walls. It was simple, peaceful, mine. Settling in, I unpacked the few belongings I'd brought, the leather folder now empty of deeds, a faded photograph of my son as a toddler, and the battered pillow he'd tossed at midnight. I placed them on a shelf where the light could touch them, reminders of a life endured and a dignity reclaimed. Weeks passed like gentle tides. Some mornings I'd watch seabirds wheel in spirals. Other days I'd trace the worn wood of my front porch, imagining every plank as a page in my story. Then one morning my granddaughter's small hand slipped into mine as she bounded up the path. Flowers clutched to her chest. Bright daisies and sea lavender gathered at low tide. She called me Grandpa, with that same hopeful spark I once saw in her father's eyes. We sat on the porch swing, her knees tucked under her chin, me listening to the creak of old chains and the soft crash of waves below. She asked me to tell the story of the house that forgot, her voice curious, tender, as though she were piecing together legends of a distant kingdom. I told her about walls I built with sweat and dreams of being locked outside when I sought only a seat at the table. I described the nights I slept on a wooden bench, and the mornings I made tea that no one drank. I painted for her the image of the lawyer's knock at dawn, the moment I reclaimed the keys to my own legacy, and how I handed them back, not in anger, but in grace. Her eyes widened as the tale grew darker and lighter with each passing moment. When I finished, she looked at me with solemn acceptance beyond her years, as if she understood that true homes aren't measured in square footage or marble floors, but in how people are seen, valued, and loved within their walls. She laid her flowers at my feet and whispered, "One day I will build a better house, Grandpa." And I smiled through tears that tasted like salt and freedom. I told her that she already knew how, not with bricks or beams, but with kindness, listening and remembering those whom others discard. She nodded and ran down to the shoreline, scattering petals in the foam. I watched her go, heart full, knowing that the real house, the one you carry inside, was already standing strong in her young hands. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat alone on the porch, the sky painted in bruised purples and soft golds. The cottage behind me felt complete, a sanctuary born from pain and forgiveness, a new beginning carved from the shards of an old life. I closed my eyes and breathed in the sea air, carrying the warmth of true belonging in my chest. And in that moment, I understood that no matter where we stand, in a grand home or a humble shed, the real house is the house of the heart, built by the way we love and remember each other.